A liberal professor challenged a royal guard to an IQ test, thinking he'd expose him as a mindless soldier. But one answer from the guard changed everything, leaving the entire class stunned and the professor humiliated. Here's what happened. But before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. And make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow, at this same time, we'll be sharing another powerful Royal Guard story you won't want to miss. The morning sun had barely risen when Lieutenant Eldon Marchmont began pressing his uniform with military precision. Every crease was measured to perfection, every button polished until it gleamed. 20 years of service to the Crown had ingrained these habits deep within his soul. Attention to detail wasn't just protocol, it was a way of life. "Oliver, are you up yet?" he called upstairs, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded men in Afghanistan and Iraq before his posting to the Queen's Guard. "You'll be late for school, son." A groan came from upstairs, followed by the shuffling of feet. At 13, Oliver Marchmont was at that age where everything his father stood for, discipline, tradition, duty, seemed hopelessly outdated. "Dad, I don't feel well, Dad," Oliver mumbled as he descended the stairs. Still in his pajamas, despite the clock showing 7:45 a.m., "I think I have a fever." He made a theatrical attempt at looking ill, complete with a weak cough that wouldn't have convinced a kid. Eldon's weathered face softened slightly as he looked at his son. Since losing his mother 3 years ago, Oliver had been drifting, searching for his place in a world that increasingly questioned the values Eldon had built his life upon. "Let me check," Eldon replied, placing his palm on Oliver's forehead with the same gentleness he used when handling his ceremonial rifle. "No fever that I can detect, Lieutenant." The old nickname usually made Oliver smile, but today it only deepened his frown. "Dad, I really don't want to go today. Can't I just stay home? Just this once." The plea in Oliver's eyes went beyond typical teenage reluctance. Eldon set aside the uniform jacket he'd been preparing and sat down at the kitchen table, gesturing for his son to join him. "Education isn't optional, Oliver. Knowledge is the foundation of everything, even my service." He tapped his temple meaningfully. "The guards aren't just about standing at attention, contrary to what some might think." Oliver stared at his untouched breakfast. "But history class is pointless. Professor Lawrence says traditions like the guards are just outdated relics that glorify imperialism." "Ah, so that's it," Eldon said. He had heard about Professor Malcolm Lawrence before. His reputation for dismissing military service and British traditions had reached even the barracks. "All the more reason to go," Eldon said firmly, rising to retrieve his scarlet tunic. "If traditions aren't taught and understood, they die, and with them the values they preserve." He checked his watch. He was due at his post in 2 hours. "Get dressed. I'll drive you myself." Oliver's eyes widened in alarm. "You're not coming in uniform, are you?" Eldon simply raised an eyebrow, his expression answering more clearly than words ever could. The drive to Westfield Academy was unusually quiet, with Oliver slouched in the passenger seat, staring fixedly out the window. Eldon navigated through London's morning traffic with the same precision he applied to everything in life. Occasionally glancing at his son, "I gather Professor Lawrence has strong opinions about the monarchy," Eldon finally said, breaking the silence as they waited at a traffic light. His voice held no judgment, only curiosity. Oliver shifted uncomfortably. "He says the guards are just theatrical puppets in an outdated pageant of fading imperialism." The boy's perfect mimicry of what was clearly the professor's phrasing made Eldon's lips twitch despite himself. "And what do you think?" Eldon asked, genuinely interested. He'd never forced his values on his son, believing that respect for tradition had to be earned, not imposed. "I don't know," Oliver admitted, plucking at a thread on his backpack. "When you tell me about your service in Afghanistan, about the brothers you lost." His voice trailed off. But then Professor Lawrence talks about how universities contribute more to society than the military ever could, and how standing guard at a palace is just a waste of human potential. Education and service aren't opposing forces, Oliver. They're complementary, Eldon said. The finest officers I've served with were also some of the most educated men and women I've known. That's not what Professor Lawrence says. He says people join the military because they're not smart enough for university, Oliver said, his voice dropping. Yesterday, he asked if I was planning to follow in Daddy's footsteps and become another mindless automaton. Eldon's knuckles whitened slightly on the steering wheel, the only outward sign that the comment had affected him. 20 years of ceremonial discipline had taught him control that went beyond mere facade. I see, he said, his voice measured. The car turned into the academy's tree-lined drive, where parents in expensive vehicles were dropping off students in crisp uniforms. Several heads turned at the sight of Eldon's distinctive scarlet tunic. I think perhaps it's time I met Professor Lawrence, Eldon said. Dad, no. Oliver's alarm was immediate. You'll just make it worse. He already singles me out because of you. Eldon parked the car and turned to face his son fully. Oliver, throughout history, those who uphold tradition have always faced criticism from those who misunderstand its purpose, but running away only reinforces their misconceptions. He checked his watch. You're already late. I'll walk you to class and speak with your professor as one educator to another. He'll humiliate you, Oliver whispered as they approached the imposing Georgian building that housed the academy. He does it to everyone who disagrees with him. Eldon straightened his bearskin cap as they climbed the stairs, several students stopping to stare at the full-dress uniform of the Queen's Guard. In my experience, he said quietly as they navigated the halls toward Oliver's classroom, those who resort to humiliation are often protecting their own insecurities. Professor Malcolm Lawrence was in full rhetorical flight when Oliver pushed open the classroom door. Tall and lean, with wire-rimmed glasses and a tweed jacket that seemed calculated to embody academic stereotype. The professor stopped mid-sentence as the door creaked. "Ah, Mr. Marchmont," Lawrence said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "How generous of you to grace us with your presence. Perhaps you can explain to the class why your arrival merits interrupting our discussion of modern British identity." Oliver froze in the doorway, 30 pairs of eyes swiveling to stare at him. Eldon placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder, guiding him forward with quiet confidence that immediately drew the professor's attention. "I believe the fault is mine, Professor," Eldon said, his voice carrying the natural authority of command without a hint of aggression. "I wanted to personally explain my son's tardiness and ensure he arrived safely." Lawrence's expression shifted as he took in Eldon's full ceremonial uniform, the scarlet tunic, the gleaming brass buttons, the bearskin cap he now held at his side with white-gloved hands. Something that might have been delight flashed across the professor's face, quickly masked by academic disdain. Well, Lawrence said, setting down his marker and leaning against his desk. "Class, it seems we have a perfect visual aid for today's discussion about anachronism, one of Her Majesty's toy soldiers in full regalia." An uncomfortable silence fell over the classroom. Oliver slipped into his seat, his face burning with embarrassment. Eldon remained by the door, his posture perfect, his expression betraying nothing of the thoughts behind his eyes. "Eldon Marchmont of the Queen's Guard," he said simply. "I merely wanted to ensure my son's safe arrival before reporting to my post. I apologize for the interruption." Lawrence's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, no apology necessary. In fact, your timing is impeccable. We were just discussing how certain British institutions persist despite having outlived their practical purpose." He turned to the class. "Students, observe the uniform, a perfect example of tradition preserved at the expense of progress. Beautiful, certainly, but utterly impractical and ceremonial rather than functional. With respect, Professor, Eldon said, his voice level. The guards are active-duty soldiers. Many of us have served in combat zones before and after our ceremonial duties. Lawrence waved this away as if swatting a fly. Yes, yes, I'm sure some of you have actual military experience. But let's be honest about what you do now. You stand motionless for tourists to photograph a human statue paid for by taxpayer money. He turned back to the class. The perfect symbol of Britain's inability to let go of imperial pageantry in a post-colonial world. Eldon showed no reaction to the insult, his discipline evident in every line of his bearing. He simply nodded once. I should leave you to your class. Thank you for accommodating Oliver's late arrival. Oh, but you simply must stay for a few minutes, Lawrence said, his voice taking on an edge of challenge. Since you've provided us with such a perfect example of tradition without purpose, perhaps you could enlighten the class about the intellectual rigors of standing perfectly still for hours. I'm sure these young minds would benefit from understanding the cognitive demands of your profession. The sarcasm was unmistakable. Several students looked mortified, while others watched with the uncomfortable fascination of witnessing a car crash in slow motion. Oliver's eyes were fixed firmly on his desk, his shoulders hunched with tension. Eldon paused, then set his bearskin cap carefully on a side table. If you believe it would be educational, Professor, I'd be happy to answer any questions about service to the Crown. Lawrence's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly not having expected Eldon to accept his thinly veiled challenge. He recovered quickly, leaning forward with exaggerated interest. How fascinating. Tell me, Lieutenant, what exactly are the intellectual requirements for joining the Queen's Guard? I imagine the ability to count to 10 and recognize primary colors must be essential for those uniform changes. His smile was razor-thin as scattered nervous laughter rippled through the classroom. The Guards draw from all regiments of the British Army, Eldon replied calmly. Each Guardsman has completed the same training as any soldier, plus additional ceremonial drill. Many have university degrees, though it's not a requirement. Not a requirement. How telling, Lawrence said, turning to the class with theatrical emphasis. In academia, advanced degrees are the baseline for entry. In the Queen's Guard, they're optional accessories like those decorative tassels. He gestured dismissively at Eldon's uniform. Education takes many forms, Professor Eldon responded, his voice steady. Military service provides lessons in discipline, strategic thinking, and leadership that complement academic knowledge. Lawrence's laugh was sharp and dismissive. Strategic thinking for standing at attention. Please, Lieutenant, let's not dress up glorified security work as intellectual endeavor. Oliver sank lower in his seat as several students glanced his way with uncomfortable sympathy. One boy near the back actually closed his notebook, as if refusing to document the unfolding scene. The modern university produces the thinkers, innovators, and leaders who shape our society. Lawrence continued, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of a lecture he'd delivered many times before. Meanwhile, ceremonial military units preserve the illusion of imperial might for a nation that can no longer project real power on the world stage. Every institution serves its purpose, Professor Eldon said. Universities expand human knowledge. The Guards preserve traditions that connect our present to our history. Ah, tradition, Lawrence said, seizing on the word like a prosecutor highlighting damning evidence. The last refuge of institutions that can't justify their existence through actual utility. Then I would suggest that dismissing what you don't fully understand is neither good scholarship nor effective teaching. Eldon replied, his voice gaining a quiet authority that commanded attention without raising volume. The Guards stand for continuity in a rapidly changing world, reminding citizens that some values transcend political shifts and technological revolutions. Lawrence's smile tightened. How charmingly medieval. And what values would those be? Blind obedience, unquestioning loyalty, the divine right of monarchs. He turned to the class. This is precisely what I mean about the danger of unexamined tradition. It preserves power structures that should have been questioned generations ago. Understanding, Lawrence said, his voice taking on a sharper edge as he moved toward Eldon with calculated deliberation. Let's talk about understanding, Lieutenant, because I think we've stumbled upon the core issue here. He turned to address the class, his academic persona fully engaged now. Critical thinking versus blind obedience. Question everything versus follow orders without hesitation. The fundamental difference between academia and military service. Eldon's expression remained neutral, though something flickered in his eyes, not anger, but something more complex. That's a rather simplistic dichotomy, Professor, isn't it? Eldon said. Lawrence shot back. Then let me propose a demonstration. He straightened, a new energy animating his movements. You've suggested that military service and academic pursuit aren't opposites, that they can complement each other. An interesting hypothesis. Let's test it. Several students straightened in their seats, sensing the shift from mere verbal sparring to something more consequential. Oliver looked up, alarm clear on his face. I've developed a set of cognitive assessments for my research on intellectual development. Lawrence continued, moving to his desk and pulling out a folder. Not quite an IQ test, those are rather crude instruments, but a more nuanced evaluation of problem-solving abilities, pattern recognition, and analytical thinking. His smile was thin with anticipated victory. Perhaps you'd indulge us in a brief demonstration. The challenge hung in the air, its implications unmistakable. Lawrence was publicly questioning not just the value of Eldon's service, but his intelligence and, by extension, that of all those who chose military careers. I have duties to attend to shortly, Eldon replied evenly, checking his watch. But if you believe it would be educational for your students, I can spare 15 minutes. Lawrence's eyebrows rose slightly, as if he hadn't expected acceptance. How accommodating of you. He began distributing papers to the front row. Students, please pass these back. You are welcome to try these problems yourselves, but I want you to observe our guest's approach. As the papers circulated, Lawrence returned to the front of the room. I used these to demonstrate the importance of flexible thinking, abstract reasoning, and innovative problem-solving, precisely the skills that rigid hierarchical systems tend to suppress in favor of conformity and rule-following. Eldon accepted a paper without comment, his white-gloved hands a stark contrast against the white sheet. The classroom had gone completely silent, the scheduled lesson forgotten in the drama unfolding before them. I won't time you formally, Lawrence said, his tone making it clear that timing was indeed happening regardless. But I am curious to see how quickly a military mind can adapt to intellectual challenges outside its customary parameters. Oliver was now sitting completely upright, his earlier embarrassment transformed into a kind of horrified fascination. The other students watched with expressions ranging from discomfort to guilty interest. Like spectators at a public execution they disapproved of but couldn't look away from. For a moment, Eldon's mind flashed back to officer candidate school, to intelligence briefings in Helmand Province, to strategic planning sessions where lives hung in the balance contexts, where analytical thinking wasn't academic exercise but survival necessity. Without comment, he picked up a pencil from a nearby desk and began to write. The classroom fell into absolute silence as Eldon worked through the first problems, his movements methodical, each solution approached with the same precision he applied to his ceremonial duties. Lawrence circled like a predator, occasionally glancing over Eldon's shoulder with poorly concealed expectation of failure. Interesting approach, the professor murmured after several minutes, loud enough for the class to hear. Most people would have used a different method for that particular type of pattern recognition. Eldon didn't respond to the bait, focusing instead on the task at hand. His pencil moved steadily across the paper, neither rushing nor hesitating. Lawrence turned to the class, unable to resist commentary. Notice how our guest approaches each problem sequentially, rather than scanning the entire set first to prioritize. Very linear thinking, typical of hierarchical training systems. Oliver watched his father with a mixture of anxiety and hope, caught between his respect for his father and his fear of seeing him humiliated in front of his classmates. The boy's fingers gripped the edge of his desk, so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "Now we come to the logical reasoning section," Lawrence announced, hovering near Eldon again. "This is where we typically see the largest gap between academic and non-academic approaches. These problems require thinking outside conventional frameworks." A few students had begun working through the problems themselves, their expressions growing increasingly impressed as they compared their work to what they could see of Eldon's. One boy in the second row actually did a double take, looking between his own paper and the guard's with poorly concealed surprise. 10 minutes had passed when Lawrence's confidence began showing its first cracks. He stopped his circling, standing instead at his desk, fingers drumming an irregular pattern on its surface. "You know, Lieutenant," he said, "most people don't complete all sections in the allotted time. Feel free to skip to the final problems if the middle section is proving challenging." "Thank you, Professor, but I prefer to be thorough," Eldon replied without looking up, his pencil continuing its steady progress. A girl in the front row stifled a smile, quickly masking it when Lawrence glanced her way with narrowed eyes. The classroom's atmosphere had shifted subtly. What had begun as a public humiliation was evolving into something altogether different. "The final section," Lawrence announced as Eldon turned to the last page, "contains what we call lateral thinking problems. They specifically require breaking free from conventional thinking patterns, something highly structured environments typically discourage." Eldon studied the final problems carefully, his approach neither hurried by Lawrence's obvious impatience nor slowed by the complexity of the challenges. Something in his methodical focus suggested that pressure was a familiar companion, not an adversary. Lawrence made a point of checking his watch. "Just 2 minutes remaining. Lieutenant, the final problem has stumped doctoral candidates, so don't be concerned if—" "Finished," Eldon said quietly, setting down his pencil and straightening the papers with military precision. He rose to his feet, the movement fluid despite having been seated in full uniform, and extended the completed assessment toward Lawrence. The professor blinked, momentarily thrown off his script. He recovered quickly, taking the papers with an artificial smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, let's see what we have, shall we, class? This should be an instructive moment about different cognitive approaches." Lawrence scanned the first page rapidly, his expression carefully neutral. The second page caused a slight tightening around his eyes. By the third, the artificial smile had completely vanished, replaced by something closer to confusion. "Interesting," he said, his voice missing its earlier theatrical quality. "You've used some unconventional approaches here. Problem solving in combat zones often requires adaptability," Professor Eldon replied evenly. "When standard procedures fail, new methodologies become necessary for survival." Lawrence's eyes narrowed as he reached the final page. The classroom remained utterly silent, 30 pairs of eyes tracking his reaction. Even Oliver had leaned forward, something like hope kindling in his expression. "The last problem," Lawrence said finally, looking up at Eldon with genuine surprise. "Your solution is unorthodox. Is it incorrect?" Eldon asked simply. Lawrence hesitated an unfamiliar experience for a man accustomed to intellectual dominance. "It's not the approach we typically see." He scanned the work again, his finger tracing Eldon's careful notations. "You've approached it from a strategic rather than purely logical framework. Strategic thinking is logical thinking applied to dynamic scenarios with incomplete information," Eldon responded, his voice taking on the tone of someone who had taught these concepts himself. Military officers are trained to find functional solutions with limited resources under extreme pressure. Lawrence wasn't accustomed to recalibrating his position, particularly in front of an audience he considered his intellectual domain. He set the papers down on his desk with deliberate care, buying himself moments to regroup. "Well," he said finally, his voice attempting to reclaim its earlier authority, "you've certainly demonstrated an unexpected aptitude for pattern recognition, though I notice your approach to the sequential logic problems relies heavily on linear methodologies rather than lateral thinking." It was a weak counterattack, and they both knew it. Eldon inclined his head slightly, neither accepting nor challenging the critique. "Perhaps," Lawrence continued, seizing on what he perceived as safer ground, "we should examine your solution to the final problem more closely. It's particularly revealing about cognitive frameworks." He held up the paper, pointing to Eldon's final answer. "Lieutenant Marchmont has approached what is essentially a pure logic problem, as if it were a tactical scenario." "Excuse me, Professor," a student in the third row interrupted, her hand half raised, "but I think his answer is correct." She flushed as all eyes turned to her. "I mean, the methodology is different, but the solution works. I checked it twice." Lawrence's expression flickered between disbelief and irritation. "Miss Chen, the standard approach to this particular problem involves differential calculus and set theory. May I?" Eldon asked quietly, gesturing toward the whiteboard. The request was so unexpected that Lawrence found himself nodding before he could formulate a refusal. Eldon moved to the board with the same measured precision that characterized his guard duties. Picking up a marker and drawing a simple diagram. "In asymmetric warfare," he began, his voice taking on a natural instructional quality that immediately commanded attention, "conventional solutions often fail because they assume resources and information that aren't available in the field." The class watched, transfixed, as Eldon's white-gloved hand sketched a representation of the problem that transformed its abstract mathematical nature into a clear strategic scenario. When facing an enemy with superior numbers or position, indirect approaches become necessary, Eldon continued, his diagram expanding to show multiple paths to the solution. "This problem asks for optimal resource allocation across variables with incomplete information. Essentially the same challenge a commander faces when planning an operation with limited intelligence and constrained resources." Lawrence stared at the developing solution, his academic certainty visibly eroding. This wasn't a ceremonial guard stumbling through academic exercises, was an expert translating between domains with unexpected fluency. The conventional mathematical approach requires perfect information," Eldon continued, adding final notations to his diagram. "But by treating these variables as tactical objectives with varying strategic values, we can derive a solution that accommodates the uncertainties built into the problem statement." He stepped back from the completed diagram. The solution was elegant in its simplicity, transforming what had been deliberately obscure into something immediately comprehensible. "Actually, sir," another student interjected, a boy who rarely spoke in class, "I think it does. It's basically applying game theory to set theory. We covered that in advanced mathematics last term." The professor's face tightened. What had begun as a public humiliation of a mere guardsman had transformed into something else entirely, a demonstration not of the guard's intellectual limitations, but of Lawrence's own narrow conception of intelligence. "Before I leave you to your lesson," Professor Eldon said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the suddenly silent classroom, "perhaps I might address a question you posed earlier about what value the guards bring to modern society." Lawrence's mouth opened, but no words came out. You asked what intellectual value there is in standing guard. Eldon began, addressing not just Lawrence but the entire classroom. Let me answer that question properly. His posture straightened almost imperceptibly, the disciplined bearing of a guard on duty now carrying a different kind of authority, not ceremonial but earned through experience and insight. The Queen's Guard consists of active duty soldiers, most of whom have served in combat zones before and after their ceremonial posting. Many hold advanced degrees in my case, a master's in military history from King's College London and a second in international security from St. Andrews. Lawrence blinked, visibly recalculating his assumptions. Several students straightened in their seats, their perception shifting before Eldon's eyes. Before standing guard at Buckingham Palace, I served 3 tours in Afghanistan, commanded a tactical intelligence unit, and was part of the strategic planning team for multinational operations in the Middle East. Eldon continued, his voice remaining measured, neither boastful nor defensive. The uniform I wear represents not just tradition, but a living connection between our history and our present. He glanced briefly at Oliver, whose face now showed open admiration. The discipline required to stand motionless isn't mindless obedience, it's the physical manifestation of mental control, focus, and commitment to something larger than oneself. The same qualities, Professor, that drive academic inquiry at its best. Lawrence opened his mouth as if to interject, then closed it again, uncharacteristically at a loss for words. You suggested earlier that universities produce the thinkers and leaders, while ceremonial guards merely preserve outdated pageantry. Eldon continued. But that creates a false opposition. The greatest military leaders throughout history have been scholars as well as warriors, from Marcus Aurelius to modern generals who hold doctorates alongside their command. Experience. He moved back toward his bearskin cap, resting on the side table where he'd placed it. The ceremonial duties I perform represent continuity in a world of constant change. They remind us that some principles, duty, honor, service to something greater than oneself transcend technological revolutions and political shifts. Eldon picked up his cap, holding it with the precise care that years of service had ingrained. The true value of tradition isn't in blindly preserving the past, but in carrying forward the wisdom it contains while adapting to present realities. He turned to Lawrence, his gaze direct but not challenging. You teach these students to question everything, Professor. That's valuable. But questioning isn't the end. Goal understanding is, and true understanding requires us to recognize that different forms of knowledge and service can complement rather than oppose each other. The classroom had fallen into complete silence. Every student fully engaged. Even Lawrence seemed transfixed, his earlier contempt replaced by something more complex, not quite respect, perhaps, but a reluctant reassessment. Oliver, Eldon said, turning to his son, I need to report for duty. Will you be all right for the remainder of the day? The boy nodded, sitting taller than he had all morning. Yes, sir, he replied, the words carrying a new weight. Eldon placed his cap on his head with practiced precision, adjusted it to regulation angle, and gave a single formal nod to the class. Thank you for the unexpected opportunity, Professor Lawrence. I hope it proved educational for your students. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked to the door with the measured pace of a man accustomed to ceremony. The click of the door closing behind him seemed to break whatever spell had fallen over the classroom. Lawrence cleared his throat, visibly struggling to reassert his academic authority. Well, he managed finally, that was certainly instructive. He turned back to the whiteboard, where Eldon's elegant solution still stood as testimony to the narrowness of his own preconceptions. Sir, the same girl who defended Eldon's solution spoke up. Could we leave that diagram up? I'd like to copy it down. I think it might help with our advanced modeling project next week. Lawrence paused, then slowly nodded. You know, that might not be a bad idea. As the lesson resumed, Oliver noticed something had changed in the classroom dynamic. Students who had never spoken up before were asking questions, engaging with the material in new ways. Even Professor Lawrence seemed different, less theatrical, more thoughtful in his responses. At the end of the class, as students gathered their materials, Lawrence approached Oliver's desk. "Your father," he said quietly, a hint of genuine curiosity in his voice. "Has he published any of his strategic analyses?" "Several," Oliver replied, a new confidence in his bearing. "His assessment of asymmetric response strategies was adopted by NATO 3 years ago." Lawrence nodded slowly, glancing toward the door through which Eldon had departed. "Perhaps," he said, more to himself than to Oliver, "we might invite him back for a proper guest lecture." Since outside, as the autumn sun filtered through London's persistent clouds, Lieutenant Eldon Marchmont returned to his ceremonial duties at Buckingham Palace. To the tourists who photographed him that afternoon, he appeared exactly as he had the day before and would the day after. Motionless, disciplined, the perfect embodiment of a tradition centuries in the making. But to those who had witnessed the morning's events at Westfield Academy, that stillness now spoke not of mindless obedience, but of a deeper kind of strength, the quiet dignity of a man who knew precisely who he was and what he stood for, whether under direct attack or standing silent guard over the values that defined him. What would you do if someone challenged your intelligence based solely on your profession or appearance? Today's story reminds us that true wisdom often comes from unexpected sources, and that we should never judge someone's intellectual capacity by their uniform, whether that's academic robes or a ceremonial guard's attire. Do you believe that certain professions require more intelligence than others, or is it possible that different roles simply demand different kinds of intellectual strengths? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story thought-provoking, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about respect, dignity, and the unexpected moments that teach us valuable life lessons. Don't forget to hit the bell icon to be notified whenever we upload new content. Check out our other Royal Guard stories appearing on your screen right now. Each one reveals something profound about honor, duty, and the quiet strength that comes from standing firm in your principles, no matter who challenges them. Remember, true intelligence isn't measured by degrees or titles, but by the wisdom to recognize value in all forms of service and knowledge.